Okay, this is Pastor Eli James, and we're going to be discussing part one of our three-part series on who the true Israelites of the Scriptures are. And in this first segment, we're going to be talking about the chronicles of the migrations of the 12 tribes of Israel from the Caucasus mountain range into Europe. And in general terms, let me just preface this section by saying that in all of our history books, we see that the Caucasian people emerged from the Caucasus range, the Caucasus mountain range. And the history books will tell us that the Israelite people, or rather the Caucasian people, emerged around 700 BC from this mountain range. But the history books don't go any further into the previous history of the Caucasian people. It's as if they dropped out of space or crawled out of the ground and just appeared out of nowhere. But we're going to find that the Caucasian people actually originated in the 12 tribes of Israel, just to the south of the Caucasus mountain range, and emerged on the north side just a few years later as the Caucasian people. And the Bible tells us very clearly that the Caucasian people are descendants of the Israelites, and that the Caucasian people would forget their origin in Israel. And so we're going to be covering several prophecies that tell us that the Caucasian people are in fact the Israelites of the Bible. I'm going to begin by quoting Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11 and 16. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Now this is a much later portion of time in history. As I said, around 700 BC is when these events happened that the Bible is talking about. So this is a second Exodus we're talking about here. A second Exodus. Verse 16, and there shall be an highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. This is Isaiah chapter 11, verse 16. This verse is clearly telling us that there is going to be a road for the people of Israel out of Assyria, Assyria being north of Palestine, across this mountain range into northern, or actually southern Europe. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. And that highway, described in verse 16, is today known as the Dariel Pass. That's part of the Caucasian mountain range. And even to this day, the local people, the local inhabitants of this region, the Dariel Pass, refer to it as the Pass of Israel. So we have ongoing history when we actually trace the history of the Caucasian people from the west backwards in time and backwards towards the east along the Danube River, the various other rivers of Europe. We find that all of our people emerged from Armenia, just south of the Caucasus mountain range. Okay, and I want to verify. There's another passage in the Bible that verifies this passageway, and this is contained in the Apocrypha. Now, most of your Bible scholars will tell you that the Apocrypha are not legitimate literature, but I'm going to demonstrate to you that they are, because the Apocrypha are actually contained in the original King James Bible. And I have a facsimile of the original 1611 King James Bible. And if you zoom in on this Bible here, you will see King James Bible with Apocrypha. All of the original King James Bibles contained the Apocrypha. They were mysteriously removed from the Bible during a period from the Revolutionary War till about 1815, after which the Apocrypha mysteriously disappeared. Scholars will tell you that they're not necessary, but I can guarantee you that they are absolutely necessary for us to understand what the Bible is actually telling us. Because if we don't know our own history, we don't know who we are. If we don't know who we are, we don't know where we're going. And it's very critical that we understand who we are and where we're going. So now in 2nd Esdras, chapter 13, let me find the reference here. I failed to circle it. Okay. 2nd Esdras, chapter 13. I'm going to start quoting from verse 39. And whereas thou sawest that he gathered another peaceable multitude unto him, those are the 10 tribes, which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, whom Shalmaneser the king of Assyria led away captive. And he carried them over the waters, which is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And so came they into another land. That other land was Armenia, which at that time was controlled by the Assyrians. But they took this counsel amongst themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, that is, the land to which the Assyrians brought them, starting in the year 745 BC, and that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. And of course, where never mankind dwelt is a reference to the wilderness of Europe. That they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. What this verse is telling us, it's verifying everything that we're told in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, that the Israelite people began practicing pagan religion because they mixed their company with the Canaanites. And the Canaanites were practicing Baal worship. And our ancestors, the true Israelites, began practicing Baal worship along with the Canaanites, having orgies in the groves and worshiping other gods and violating Yahweh's laws. And because our people, our ancestors, refused to stop disobeying his laws by engaging in these pagan rituals, they were expelled. Repeating verses 41 and 42. But they took this counsel amongst themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, which is the other nations around them, and go forth into a farther country where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes, which they had never kept in their own land. This is a tremendous summary of how the Israelites were relating to their God Yahweh and failing to obey his laws. And he promised these people that if they continue in disobedience, that he would expel them into the wilderness. And this is exactly what he did. Now it amazes me that your average Christian theologian knows absolutely nothing about these verses and about the history of these verses. Probably because the Apocrypha have been deleted from the Bible by some mysterious force, and these same people tell you, well, it's not important. It's not important that you know these things. Well, if you don't know these things, you're not going to know who you are. And it's very important that you know who you are. Continuing with verse 44, for the Most High then shone signs for them, and held still the flood, till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Ar-Sareth. Ar-Sareth is the territory north of the Caucasian Mountains. And so these verses are very clearly telling us that from Armenia they crossed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they went up through the Dariel Pass, through the Caucasus Mountains, and wound up on the other side, Ar-Sareth. And we know from tracing the history of our people from this area, their primary route into Europe was the Danube River, because the Danube River dumps into the Black Sea just west of the Caucasus Mountains, and by their ships, because our ancestors, both by ship and by covered wagon, migrated west into Europe, where such nations as Denmark, named after the tribe of Dan, Zebulon settled in the nation today called Holland, Issachar settled in the nation called today Finland, and we have places such as the Frisian territory, and Germany, Saxon. The Saxon area is named after Isaac, as a matter of fact, because Genesis 21:12 tells us, "In Isaac shall thy seed be called." Of course, no one ever quotes these verses, because if they quote these verses, you will ask, well, why aren't the Jews called by the name of Saxon? That's because they're not Saxons and they're not Israelites, as we will evidently and ultimately prove to you in this three-part series. Now, the Bible tells us that the Israelites would be known by another name, that they would be a great seafaring people, a great agricultural people, great builders of cities and nations. None of these things is true of the Jewish people. The fact is that if we go back into Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, we will find that there are two different groups of people that the Bible talks about. Two different genealogies. And one genealogy is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, carried through from Adam and Eve, down through Abraham, down through Isaac and Jacob, and ultimately, of course, Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus Christ has relatives in Europe called the Caucasian people, and we're going to be demonstrating that we are, in fact, his relatives, and the Jewish people are not. In fact, he disowns the Jewish people in many places in the New Testament. Now, we know also that Queen Elizabeth II today is, in fact, a literal descendant of King David. And there's a parable of the 153 fishes in the New Testament. And it turns out that from Adam to Queen Elizabeth II, there are 153 generations in this genealogical record. So all these numbers in the Bible have meanings, and we are going to investigate these meanings. Now, the Jews have not had a king. The Jews have not had a king since the days of Herod Agrippa. In fact, the Jewish people have only had 4 or 5 kings in their entire history. The first one being Herod the Great. And then he had offspring who continued as kings in Judea until the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 A.D. These are the only kings that the Jewish people have. But when we start quoting the marks of Israel, the true history, the prophetic record, and the historical record of the Israelite people, we will find that we have an unbroken genealogy, dynasty, of kings from David down to Queen Elizabeth II. The Jewish people cannot say this because they are not the Israelites of the Bible. Now we're going to be discussing the greatest plot of the Bible, which has been a forgotten plot, and it talks about the missing Israelites. How did the Israelites become a missing people, and how are we going to rediscover this people in the modern world? I'm going to be quoting now from Romans 11, chapter 1, which tells us this. I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So here Paul is telling us very clearly that he is a member of one of these 12 tribes. Now remember, earlier on, I said that the house of Judah, the southern house of Judah, remained in Judea. And this house of Judah consisted of only 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah. So Paul was in fact a member of the house of Judah, of the tribe of Benjamin, and distinguishing himself from the lost tribes, which were in Arsareth, which had already disappeared 700 years before. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that the Judahites of the days of Jesus Christ understood that their kinsmen, the dispersed Israelite tribes, were actually living around the area of Judea, in Greece, in Rome, in Armenia, in Europe, and they knew this. They knew these things. And the New Testament tells us that they knew these things. For example, James 1:1 tells us, it introduces the book of James by saying, to the 12 tribes of Israel scattered abroad, greetings. That's how that book opens up. So James clearly understood that all 12 tribes were still in existence in his time, and he sent his epistle to them. Okay? Now, in this synopsis of the disappearance and reemergence of the 12 tribes of Israel, we're going to demonstrate that Israel was divided into 2 houses, the 10-tribe northern house of Israel, and the 2-tribe southern house of Judah. Also, that the house of Israel rebelled against Yahweh's law, adopting pagan practices, and was taken captive by the Assyrians as punishment for their refusal to obey his laws. Number 3, well into the future, these Israelites will retain much of their pagan heritage. And in fact, this is why we have so much pagan heritage in our European culture, such as Beltane, such as the Christmas tree, which actually goes back into Old Testament times, etc. Number 4, the house of Judah later on was taken captive into Babylon for a period of 70 years, but returned to Judah, the land of Judah, and reestablished their kingdom. So there's an unbroken genealogy from King David all the way to Queen Elizabeth II, and we will demonstrate that to you. The house of Judah had a distinct mission in the land of Judah to bring forth the Messiah. After the Messiah was brought forth and he performed his atoning sacrifice for his people Israel, that's when the history of the house of Judah in Judea ends. But we pick it up in Europe because we European Caucasians are in fact his genealogical relatives. Number 6, that the various tribes of Israel founded numerous nations, first in Europe and then all over the world. And as a matter of fact, Britain and America were established by the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. That ultimately, that the two houses would one day be merged back together, so that there would no longer be a separation of the two houses. And this was prophesied by the two sticks prophecy in the book of Ezekiel. Now in number 9, the nation where the physical reunification took place was in fact the United States of America, and this is according to prophecy. It's not that little nation in the Middle East of those unbelievers. Remember, Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians 6:14 not to be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So what we are doing, we Americans and the rest of us true Israelites are doing by supporting that Jewish state, is we're actually supporting the Antichrist. We are not supporting the Christ at all, because that nation was never prophesied to be the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to prove to you today that the United States of America is the regathering of the 12 tribes of Israel. Also, and finally, just before the judgment day, these people who don't know who they are, but will remember who they are, will, just before the return of Christ, remember who they are and become the bride of Christ. Now we're going to continue in our historical study of the division of the 12 tribes into two houses. We will now turn to the book of 1 Kings, chapter 11, verses 26 through 42, and it tells us this. And Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zereda, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zeruiah, a widow woman, even he lifted up his hand against the king. This is telling us that there's going to be a civil war. I'm going to jump down to verse 31 and verse 30. And Ahijah caught a new garment that was on him and rent it into 12 pieces. This is the prophet Ahijah. And he grabbed this garment and tore it into 12 pieces. And this is what he said to Jeroboam after he did this. Take thee 10 pieces, for thus saith Yahweh, the God of Israel, behold, I will rend the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon, and will give 10 tribes to thee, speaking to Jeroboam, the Ephraimite. But he shall have 1 tribe for my servant David's sake, that is, the king of Judah, and for Jerusalem's sake, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. So here is where the Bible is declaring the civil war and the split, the breakup of the 12 tribes into two houses. Verse 33, because that they have forsaken me, and have worshipped Ashtoreth, or otherwise known as Astarte, the goddess of Easter, the goddess of the Zidonians. The Zidonians were a Canaanite tribe. Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Milcom, the god of the children of Ammon. These are all Canaanite tribes. and have not walked in my ways, to do that which is right in mine eyes, and to keep my statutes and my judgments, as David his father did. So Yahweh is clearly expressing his displeasure with the Israelite people here for engaging in Canaanite practices. Howbeit, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him prince all the days of his life after David, for David my servant's sake, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes. So Solomon and his genealogy will retain the two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, but Jeroboam and the northern 10 tribes will depart, and ultimately, as we have been seeing, ultimately be taken captive into the wilderness of Europe. Okay? Verse 39, and I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. This is a prophecy of the fact that they will be taken captive into Babylon a bit later. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt, unto Shishak, king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. And the rest of the acts of Solomon, all that he did, and his wisdom, are they not written in the book of the acts of Solomon? And at the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Now this history of the breakup of the 12 tribes into two houses is extremely important. Now when Rehoboam sent a tax collector, Rehoboam is the descendant of Solomon, and Rehoboam was he instituted heavy taxation on all 12 tribes. But the 10 northern tribes objected to this heavy taxation. And when Rehoboam sent the tax collector Adoram into the north country, they stoned him to death. Just like we Americans don't like tax collectors today, our ancestors did not like tax collectors then. Verse 20 in 2 Kings chapter 12, and it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was come again, that they sent and called him unto the congregation, and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed after the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. And when Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah with the tribe of Benjamin, and 180,000 chosen men, which were warriors, to fight against the house of Israel, to bring the kingdom again to Rehoboam the son of Solomon. So we here have evidence of a civil war, the breaking up of the 10 northern tribes away from the house of Judah. And in verse 24 we are told that this breakup is declared by Yahweh himself, for this thing is from me. So it's very important to understand that the 12 tribes were divided into two houses, the 10 northern tribes and the southern 2 tribes. Now continuing with the book of 1 Kings in chapter 12, it explains how Ahijah's prophecy to Jeroboam was fulfilled in Samaria, because Samaria became the capital of the 10 northern tribes. Verse 25, then Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim, and dwelt therein, and went out from thence, and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David, Jeroboam being the king of the 10 northern tribes. And rather than allow his people to go down to Judah to make sacrifices, for fear that they might be repatriated to King Rehoboam, he forbade them to do so, and actually built a second temple in Shechem. And whereupon, verse 28, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. So now this new king of the 10 northern tribes instituted a new pagan religion in opposition to the Israelite religion, the house of Yahweh, which stayed in place in Judah, in the southern 2 tribes. In verse 33, so he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even in the month which he had devised in his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel, and he offered upon the altar and burnt incense. So this is the beginning of the pagan religion that our ancestors brought with them into Europe. Now, verse 33. After this thing, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way, but made again of the lowest of the people priests, and of the high places. The high places being the Canaanite religion sources. They practiced their religion on the mountaintops and in the groves. Whosoever would, he consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. So what Jeroboam did here was he created a new priesthood simply by selecting people that he favored and made them priests in opposition to the Levitical priesthood, which was still functioning in the house of Judah. Now, this type of disobedience was not liked by Yahweh our God, and during the continuing history of these people, we had a king called Omri. This king Omri was known to the Assyrians as Gomri, and it was known to the Greeks in a later period as Cumru. In fact, the Welsh people today still refer to themselves as the Cumru, because we will be demonstrating that the Cumru originated in Assyria, in Armenia, and migrated from Armenia to Wales, where they still speak fluent Hebrew. It's called Welsh today. And so as we trace the histories of these migrations, we find that we can indeed establish a linguistic, historical, and scriptural connection to our origin in the 12 tribes of Israel. I'm going to quickly digress into demonstrating the Welsh connection to the Hebrew language. For example, the word aeth, meaning he went or he is gone, is in Hebrew atah, or A-T-H-A-H. The Welsh amel, meaning plentiful or ample, in Hebrew hamali, and Edom, Y-D-O-M, Adama. Awi, air or sky in Hebrew is Aor. In Welsh, B-U, boo, it came to pass, bo in Hebrew. Botan in Welsh, meaning belly, or betan in Hebrew. These are just a small sampling of the connections between Welsh and Hebrew. And the reason why Welsh still retains much of its Hebrew roots is because the Cimmerians, so-called, which are the original Welsh people, took their Hebrew language with them and migrated very quickly from Armenia all the way to Wales. Okay, and that's why they maintained their Hebrew language. But for the majority of the Israelites, we are told in Isaiah chapter 28, verse 11, that the majority of our people will get a new language. And we are told, for with stammering lips and another tongue will he speak to this people. So for the majority of the Israelites, we will be speaking in a new language. And of course that new language is English. And we find that there are numerous idiomatic expressions in English that derive from the Hebrew. And I'm going to quote from a couple of scholars to demonstrate this. Quote, "The idiomatic likenesses between English and Hebrew were noticed by Tyndale when he translated the scriptures. He said, quote, 'The properties of the Hebrew tongue agreeth 1,000 times more with the English than with the Latin. The manner of speaking is in both one, so that in 1,000 places there need not be but to translate the Hebrew word for word into English.'" This is Tyndale speaking about his experience in translating the Old Testament into English. And what he's telling us is all he had to do is replace the Hebrew words with English words, not even worry about the syntax, and the sentences made perfect sense. Canon Lyson found in 5,000 Hebrew roots in the English language. Other authorities who put the figure higher, that there are way more than 1,000 places where the English and the Hebrew agree. He states, "The Welsh is so much like the Hebrew that the same syntax may be used for both. The Old Saxon language is said to be 80% Hebrew. The oldest poems in the Celtic language are in the Book of Dun Cow, composed in 1106 AD. and are not unlike the poetic passages in the Old Testament. So we find that when we actually access the history of the Anglo Saxon, Celtic, and Caucasian people, and we access these historians, these old-time historians that are totally ignored today, that we show our connection to the old Hebrew people. So now I'm going to get into the subject of prophecy. And the fact is that when the 10 northern tribes were taken captive, it was in the year 745 BC, and the Assyrian king at that time was Tiglath-Pileser III. And we are told in Putnam's Dictionary of Events, copyright 1927, page 6, quote, 745, accession of Tiglath-Pileser III of Assyria, who wages war against Chaldea, Syria, and the kingdom of Israel. This is quoted again in Putnam's Dictionary of Events. And of course, Tiglath-Pileser is called Pul in the Bible in 2 Kings 15:19 and 1 Chronicles 5:26. So we have a historical connection between these Bible verses and this scholarly assessment of what happened in those days, as an archaeologist speaking. Okay, so now these deportations, which occurred under several Assyrian kings, lasted from approximately 745 BC to well into the 7th century, into the late 1600s. Late 600s of BC. And these prophecies include the book of Isaiah and several other books of the Old Testament. And it also includes the time when King Sennacherib invaded Judah, the land of Judah, around 701 BC, and he took 185